Welcome back, SmythOS enthusiasts. We are about to roll up our sleeves and dive into the heart of SmythOS. We create your very first agent. In this video, we will walk you through the process step by step, exploring the key components and best practices for building an effective SmythOS agent. Let's join Mike as he guides us through this exciting journey of turning concepts into reality.
SmythOS, what I want to do is jump right into creating a new blank agent, right? And we'll just call it my first agent. We can actually use any one of these templates. I can leave select template blank, or I can say empty agent. In this case, I'm going to say empty agent, say my first agent. So let's just kind of do a walk around for this agent, right? And for the Smith UI. So first and foremost, you'll see that components play kind of a first-class role.
As Mike demonstrates, creating an agent starts with a blank canvas. Let's see how he builds it up from scratch.
Components start with our base components and advanced components. We'll absolutely get into using advanced components on day 3, even in day 2. But our base components, in particular, the API endpoint and the LLM prompt and the API output, those are really kind of the core foundation of what you'll end up using inside of SmythOS.
Mike highlights the importance of components in SmythOS. Pay close attention to the 3 core components he mentions next.
Again, that's the API endpoint, the LLM prompt, and the API output, right? So that's here inside of your agent. And then you'll see that there's the advanced components. Call API is that component that allows you to, you can see I just dragged and dropped that component right onto here. This is the component that allows you to call and interact with those APIs that you hear about on your applications.
These 3 components form the backbone of any SmythOS agent. Now, let's watch as Mike starts to construct the workflow.
If you're generating content, let's say you're using something like SEMrush. SEMrush has an API and you can call it, right? Well, but you probably wouldn't want to do that because you probably actually want to use, a SEMrush or Ahrefs integration to actually do that work. So you can, for example, call these to get backlinks or look at a particular things, get the referring domains. These are all things that you could do with Ahrefs, but let's say you want to go beyond that and there's something very specific. You can use that call API piece to make that happen. So every Smith agent needs to ultimately start with an API endpoint. And the API endpoint is where your API really starts. And I'm just going to be kind of corny here and just start with start here. So, and walk through, let's say you make an API call. You can see that you have the ability to have inputs and outputs. So, for example, your input here may be my topic. You change the color. I like to change the colors on these. And then you can describe this particular input. This can be helpful when you're using a chatbot, which is actually another LLM, to understand what this actual parameter is and what it's used for. And then what happens is when that endpoint is called, there's headers. These are some technical things that sit as part of the request response lifecycle. There's a package that gets sent back and forth, or that gets sent and received. There's also this thing called a body, and the query is when you, in particular, when you have a get, that's actually part of the URL that comes in for a get. It's going to end up being a query. Those end up going into your inputs.
Mike emphasizes the crucial role of the API endpoint. Watch how he sets it up and customizes it.
So for example, you wouldn't just call an API, you would need to trigger that API, in which case you may have something called a trigger. And then you just want this API to happen, and then it's a trigger, that API gets called, and then you want an LLM prompt to actually process that data, and then maybe take something very specific from that body, and then use that as input, and then let's say add another input. You drop that into your API data, and then you can actually build out your prompts by pulling in so you can build right into your prompts. This is something you can't do inside of ChatGPT. These inputs that are there, and you can see right here, we're looking at the interface for SmythOS. You're seeing an LLM prompt right now. Here's an API call, and you'll notice when I click on this little gear icon, it changes and allows you to actually add that API call. Oftentimes I find that what I'm doing is I'm doing a post to get back a bunch of data, or I may be doing a get if, for example, I'm searching for a list of users. We'll talk more about get and post on Thursday. The API endpoint itself has some very important pieces that we're going to look at. Everything that, for a decent agent that's going to work appropriately in a production environment, there are two key things that you need that make a well-formed agent. One is the API endpoint, and the other is the API output, and something in between to actually do something with it. Now, what am I doing here?
Here, Mike demonstrates how to connect different components to create a functional workflow. Pay attention to how he incorporates the LLM prompt into the process.
What am I doing here? I'm like, hey, wait a minute, there's nothing going on here. Why not? Well, that's because I don't have any inputs. So the input may just be a trigger, right? If you're working on a process, you're not working on a chatbot where you're looking for a reply and you just want to finish this, that's really important, because in some cases, let's say you've got a webhook, and what's happening in that webhook is saying, hey, I want to call the API endpoint to add a person, right? So this is my workflow. In my workflow, I'm going to call an API to add that person. I'm then going to use an LLM prompt to do something with that person's data, as well as with what was submitted with your topic, and then present that as a particular output. In this case, it would not be a trigger, but it would actually be some data. But if you were just trying to insert the person and not do anything with it, we would just go directly from the API data to here. I'm going to drop this. And then I like to call, and you'll see other Smith people do this, in order to move forward, I use a trigger. So that's when I'm just taking the response. I don't care, as long as there is a response, I want to make sure that I actually trigger the API output. What that means is that the process that's calling this endpoint has an output. That output then comes back and says, I, SmythOS, am done. Really important for a lot of processes that are automated, that this gets done within 5 to 10 seconds. So really important that you think about it and look at it that way. So There is a very, very simple basic agent and a very simple and basic workflow. Um, you can obviously use integrations to make that work, but this is where you start. You start off with an endpoint, and you have an output, and then you have things in between that you work with. You do things like, for example, an API call, or let's say you want to notify someone in Discord. You would send a message in Discord. This is not going to be ready to do that, but say that's what you wanted to do, and then the response would essentially here be a trigger as well, because the the interaction or the notification happens in Discord. Once it's done, what that is saying is hey, I sent my topic in that message to Discord, and now I'm done with my output. So this workflow is done. Okay. So please, I understand this could be generating some questions. Do make sure that you have some questions to bring to the table as we progress. You could do things like, for example, send an SMS as opposed to send a message to Discord. You can, there is Microsoft Teams. So if you want to create a chat, list chats, or actually send a chat, you can actually do that. You could add an event to a calendar, if you remember that came up as part of the examples. All sorts of things that you could do here, but all of it starts with an endpoint and ends with an output, right? So that's the core interface, and a lot of what you'll be doing is basically taking components, dragging and dropping them, and then interconnecting them between different components. You can then, let's say you wanted to actually interact with this via chatbot, you could test it. This chatbot is its own LLM that's actually going to interact or can interact with your agent. But guess what? If you don't properly set this up, it will so you don't have a skill for that, but it's going to sure look for that and see that, hey, there's an error here, but I'll give you an answer anyway. So you can see here that because it's an LLM, or essentially kind of like almost like interacting with ChatGPT, your chat here can actually kind of go off the rails. So you want to make sure that you actually either give it that capability or kind of draw in lines to make sure that that doesn't happen. Okay, that's the chat. And then we talked about we have an API here. Well, guess what? There's my add a person API call. You can actually test that API call by giving it, in this case, it happens to be a topic. You can try it out and say my topic is Mike, and then execute that API call. It will actually go and perform this. You can take this and run it as a curl call. You can actually then import this into something like Postman, and there's a URL. You could actually take this URL right now and execute this from your web browser as well and get back the response. We'll do that as we progress. So that's the API side of things. There's the chatbot. The GPT piece is really showing you how and where you would actually deploy this as a GPT. And Postman allows you to export this to test it inside of Postman, and gives you instructions on how to drag and drop a Postman collection directly into your agent, right?
As you've seen, building a SmythOS agent is a process of connecting components logically to create a workflow. Mike goes on to demonstrate how to test your agent using the built-in chatbot and how to expose your agent as an API. These are crucial steps in the development and deployment process.
Don't worry, we will go into a lot of details on these. So let's do something a little bit more fun here. please expound on the latest research known or this topic for and then we're going to say input. We're going to take the body and we're going to pull that in. And we're going to, by the way, I'm going to change this from a trigger into there and make sure that for this API output, I'm giving it full and not minimal. And now I can actually test this inside of my agent. Even though it's called add a person, it's going to find it in this case. And it's basically expounding on that. Now, let's say we want to actually see a little bit more about what we're actually doing here. We can turn on this thing called debug. And in debug, it actually allows you to walk step by step through each one of these, even while you're actually working. So I'm going to actually refresh the chatbot here. I'm going to go into the agent. Sorry, my screen decided to jump out of my view. So you're going to see it's going to try and contact the agent. It's attaching the debugger. It's attached. It's run that endpoint. And we could see from here, here's the body, but it appears that it didn't like the topic. So what it actually did is it actually used it as a query and took generative AI research. So what's going to happen here? You could probably guess. I took the body when I needed to actually get the query, but I wouldn't have known this. And so what I actually saw before was not this, but because I used debug, I now see that it was not in the body, but actually in the content. I'm sorry, the query. So what I need to do is go ahead and stop my agent because I know that there's nothing here, right? And it's basically going to return nothing out of it. And then you can see it's like, well, maybe there should be something here. And it's going to give you a nice little message like, I'm sorry, I'm not able to give you updates on the latest research or this topic. Let me go ahead and move along. So I'm going to go ahead and run here. And there you go. So part of this we can take care of by reconnecting the query here and looking at my topic. And let's say we want to be very, very specific and clear here. We don't want to change things up. We just want to look at generative AI research. So we're going to pull that right into here, and we are going to see if we can't go ahead and step through that, and we're going to give it that topic. We're going to debug right within here to see what happens. And see, there's the topic. I'm using this UI here to look at that. And then I'm going to step. And now I can see the input. And let's see what the LLM did with that, right? So it says, oh, here's your research, latest research, advancements, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so let's go ahead and try this now. All right, the API output closes it up. Let's now try and go do this inside of here. Change the topic up for us a bit. So what it's doing here is it's actually going directly to its own knowledge about OpenAI. Part of that is because this LLM is OpenAI. The thing we would need to do is to go ahead and fix this because it has no instructions. So it didn't know that it needs to actually take that topic. So we would fix it by actually giving it instructions as take any topic and provide more information on that topic. And you could think of that as a way to guide that chat application to know that this API endpoint, and I would also want to, just because it's I like to do that. So this information here, it actually does give the chat LLM information, and that's why exposed to API, which would be, for example, a GPT for ChatGPT or chatbot. If I uncheck this, it's never going to use it. Okay. So, for example, if I uncheck this, you'll see that those instructions go away because it's not interacting with it. A lot of information, a lot of stuff here. Let's go ahead and shift back over. We're running a little bit long to kind of talk about what we did. We looked at what is an agent. We looked at a kind of chatbot embodiment. We looked a little bit at the API embodiment. We looked at the components and how you actually build an agent. This is the settings page, and it's accessible via API, chatbot. We talked about this. We've mentioned and showed you very quickly the instructions for building it in a GPT, and it contains one or more workflows. We just had one workflow that we were working with. It can be locked down via an API key itself. So when others are calling your API key, you can force it to use a specific bearer API key, and SmythOS makes that very easy for you to set up and deploy on your domain, either as an API key or on your website if you're doing something with a chatbot. Okay. We talked about workflows. What do workflows start with? An API endpoint. Every workflow will start with an API endpoint. It contains one or more components that should all flow to end in an API output. It can have branches, but SmythOS doesn't loop. It will someday soon, I'm sure, and can use other agents, and it's easy to debug. You saw that. You saw how I could find out why it wasn't doing what I thought it should be doing. And by the way, I did that on purpose, if you haven't figured that out. And a single agent can have many workflows. It's not just one. And depending upon what you're doing, that would be a different API call or a different skill that's exposed to the chatbot LLM or to the GPT if you're going to expose it via GPT. Okay. We talked and showed you a little bit about components. We looked at API components, LLM components, code component we didn't look at specifically, but I raced through it. And we looked at integrations. There's also flow control components. You can also add other agents and GPTs. And then you can interact with data pools, including to build them or query them. And then here's just that list of components again. As you can see, there's a lot here. You'll see that there's also the ability to use Hugging Face for those of you who are familiar with Hugging Face, you can pull in Hugging Face models as well and interact with those as APIs. And there's a ton of other things that you could do in here. And this list is growing, and everything here is also accessible via that API call component that I talked about before. We looked at components and what goes into a component. And specifically for the LLM component, we looked at the prompt. We played around with some of the variables for the prompt. And we looked at inputs, outputs, and then some of the settings. We didn't look at the debug log, but that's part of it. And then we looked at the settings for those components. With that, we'll end the lecture, and we are going to get into our first fun here. And everybody, you're more than welcome at this point. This is the end of my lecture portion and the beginning of our exercise in interaction and collaboration.
Remember, practice makes perfect. Don't be afraid to experiment with different components and workflows as you build your own agents. In our next video, we'll apply the basics you learned and create your very first chatbot. Keep building, and we'll see you in the next lesson.